then went on to get his master's at Columbia for English and comparative literature. And then went on, of course, to also win the Nottingham Jazz competitions. But in addition to all that, he was able to use his skill set to not only be this great YouTube performer that you saw. If you haven't checked it out, go to YouTube and check his channel out. He also received a big grant to do trio music in people's homes. It's called a housewarming project, and they have already toured at least 26 states, literally doing what musicians used to do, to just play music in people's homes, and it's still ongoing on that. In addition to that accomplishment, he's also the best-selling author on piano jazz fundamentals on Amazon, using his writing skills and the musician skills. And then lastly, he also has well-published compositions with Hal Leonard, one of the biggest publishers on music. So please join me in giving the biggest applause to welcome Mr. Siskind back to the stage.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Right. Can I just get a sense of who's in the room? So how many pianists? Oh, pianists. All right. Good. Everybody else leave. No, I'm just kidding. How many wind players? Sounds like maybe. Strings? Percussion? Vocals? Jazz? No jazz musicians at all? Jazz over there, good. Music ed? Music technology? Who am I leaving out? What did I not say? I got them all? And community members? I think maybe teaching faculty? Okay. Well, so today what I want to do is I want to tell you about a project that kind of ended up changing my life in a number of ways. The project was writing a set of perpetual motion etudes for piano. I want to tell you why I did it. I'm going to guide you through some of the music and how I got inspired in these compositions. And then I'm going to tell you about what it meant to my life and career and how, a lesson that I'm hoping that you'll take away is how sometimes we might do some projects and not know where they'll lead. But if you put a lot of heart and soul and effort and intelligence into things, I'm a big believer that they'll lead somewhere eventually. But I made a little list just so that you get to know me and my career a little bit. I think I do have a privilege of having a very especially diverse career. It might be, I'm not saying it's better or worse than anybody else's, but I get to do a lot of things. So I made a little list of some things that I did over my winter break. And so the first one is that I got to publish a second edition of my book, Playing Solo Jazz Piano. I got to play in Walt Disney Hall in Los Angeles, the Hall of the LA Phil, with Arturo Sandoval, who's a 10-time Grammy-winning trumpet player, which was pretty cool and unexpected. I recruited students for my classes. I'm a full-time faculty member at a community college. I recruited about 60 students. I organized this tour where I'm visiting 5 universities. I'm the chair of the creative track for the National Conference for Keyboard Pedagogy, and we had to select programming for our upcoming conference. I wrote 6 arrangements for the New World Symphony's Cabaret Night in February. New World Symphony is a great organization in Miami. An album that I did a lot of arrangements for by the great soprano Julia Bullock came out in December and started getting reviews, which was exciting. And NPR named it the 13th best album of the year. Beyonce was #1. Can't compete with that. I planned new classes with the Open Studio online teaching platform. I edited the Italian translation of one of my books. I published 2 YouTube videos every week, and I did 2 arrangements for a soprano named Laura Pearl for Exit New Music Cleveland, something like that. So I'm getting to do all these things. I'm getting to publish, I'm getting to compose, I'm getting to perform, I'm getting to teach, and that, I don't think there's any award for being busy. I don't think that makes me a better person than anybody, but I enjoy having a diverse career. And so I'm hoping that maybe some of the insights here are gonna help you think about how you might have a diverse and intentional career. Okay, so perpetual motion etudes. In 2020, in March 2020, in fact, I published this book and came out with a CD plus a video series of 9 new etudes that I'd written for piano. And the whole project started because I was really inspired by these 2 guys. So on the left is my former teacher, Fred Hirsch. On the right is the great jazz pianist, Brad Meldau. And they both played in this style in which they were alternating in these interesting ways between their two hands. So Fred Hirsch, he has this one solo that I just like became obsessed with, where he goes. Creating in these fascinating ways between the hands. And I was like, oh, that's cool. I want to be able to do that. And Brad Meldau writes these kind of pseudo-classical pieces where he's filling in every single eighth note to create these kind of interesting cross rhythms and these ways that the rhythm, despite not being in a traditional jazz rhythm like swing or bossa nova or samba or salsa, just has this sense of propulsive, consistent rhythm. So one of the pieces by him that I really like is called Resignation. You're all music majors, you'll tell me what time signature this is in after I play. What's the time signature? It's not 4/4. It's not 6/8. I'll count it for you. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1, 2, 3. Or you can count it 4 and 3. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, We call that like the 7/4 clapping. Everybody clap that with me just so that you can experience that if you haven't before. So I'll do it a couple times first. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. So it's 2 half notes, 2 guided chords. Keep going. Keep going. Most of you are making it. So Brad Meldau's writing these really creative, interesting, textured pieces using this perpetual motion style. So what do I mean when I say perpetual motion? So kind of the definition of perpetual motion would be that whatever the rhythmic unit is, so we might be talking eighth notes, we might be talking 16th notes, we might be talking eighth note triplets, we're filling in every one of those rhythmic units without a rest or a hole interrupting it. Now, so this is a perpetual motion machine. It's not really related, but it's kind of the same concept. Here's another perpetual motion machine, just kind of for fun. What's really interesting on the piano, you're all mesmerized, I love it. What's really interesting on the piano is that, of course, we have 2 hands, so we can create different sorts of combinations of rhythms within that perpetual motion. We can mix single notes with diads, 2-note chords, or triads, 3-note chords. We can use really low notes or really high notes. So basically within these rhythmic textures, these consistent rhythmic textures, we can create a lot of interest through what I would call groupings, right? So for instance, even if we're in 4/4, we might be grouping things in 3, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2. And there's so many interesting ways to create different groupings. In fact, this is kind of what jazz is based on. If you think like back to the Maple Leaf Rag, what made ragtime ragged or syncopated sound. So I want to show you, skip that. I'm going to skip that for now. I want to show you my first perpetual motion etude, which I call Sometimes I Wander. And I want to focus on this second measure here. I know it's maybe a little bit small, but what you can see here is that the right-hand notes that have the tenuto signs over them are happening in groups of 3. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 groups of 3, right? 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3. And then it's 1, 2, 1, 2. And one insight that I learned in college, which was kind of, I've thought about ever since, is that you can create any sort of rhythm by mixing groups of 2s and groups of 3s, right? So you think about 4, 4, we usually think of that as 4 groups of 2 eighth notes. If you think about 3, 4, it's 3 groups of 2 eighth notes. But if we want to do fun time signatures, we just stack different groups of 3s and 2s. If we want to do 5, 8, we do 3 and 2, right? If we want to do 7, 8, we do 3, 2, 2, or some sort of combination of that. So if you want to create some weird rhythms, just like put a random string of 3s and 2s together. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just mixing some 3s and 2s, and it comes out kind of funky and syncopated. So with each of these etudes, I identify as a jazz pianist, but I just love the piano more than anything. So I love, classical piano music. I'm just kind of fascinated by the possibilities of this instrument. So what I did with this collection is I wrote pieces that could be played by a classical pianist. They're fully notated, fully through composed. But they each have little off-ramps for improvisation. And so if a classical pianist were to play all 9 etudes, it would probably take about 20 minutes. Some of them are really pretty miniature. But when I play them, it takes about an hour because I take the off-ramps and I improvise. I've gotten to do some 2 piano concerts playing these etudes, including I got to play at Weill Hall at Carnegie Hall, where I'll play with the classical pianist and they'll play the written out part, they'll pass it over to me for the improvised part, and that's really fun because it's way less stressful for me if I don't have to play the written out part, because that's the hard part for me. So in the book, I put optional improvisation instructions. I think I have some here to show you. Nope. Next slide, where it kind of gives chord symbols and some general tips on how and where to improvise. So, there's those instructions. I missed the slide somehow. So what I'd like to do is to play Sometimes I Wander for you, and I want you to listen for those groupings of 2 and 3. Now, this is what is sometimes called in the classical world a toccata. It's very clearly about the back and forth between the 2 hands and filling in every single 16th note with the back and forth between the 2 hands. And you could almost imagine it as a snare drum solo. And I'm going to show you some different views of perpetual motion in a second, but I want to start with this one, Sometimes I Wander. So part of the impetus behind writing these pieces and thinking about this style for me, and I wonder if you performers can relate, is that I often have this moment when I'm performing where maybe I think a little bit too hard about where I am and how stressed I feel, and it always makes me mess up. Has that ever happened to anybody, that you're like in the middle of a performance and all of a sudden you're like, oh my God, look at where I am? Or for me, it's often, wow, I haven't taken a breath in a while. I need to breathe. And I start breathing and then I'm like, oh, look around me. Oh no. So these perpetual motion etudes, of course, they don't leave any musical place to breathe. And they're also this intensive high wire act where if you get a little bit off, you can get really off. So these were this kind of way to put myself, to put my feet to the fire, so to speak, and force myself to, keep this flow going, even as those thoughts maybe come into my head, and get used to having those thoughts and dismissing them and continuing on with the music. It's certainly a process I'm very much still working on, but it's part of the idea of why I wrote these etudes for myself and why I forced myself to perform them. So let me talk about the next one a little bit. So this is a very different etude. You can even see, looking at the score, that instead of just kind of an alternation between the hands in this kind of toccata style, this is actually, I think of it as being in 4 parts. You could argue that it's in 3. But you can see there's a bass with the stem down in the left hand. There's a melody with the stem up in the right hand, and then the 2 hands are sharing an inner part. And so I wrote this one very differently, whereas the first one I was thinking rhythmically, I was thinking percussively. Da, 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 da. This one, I came up with the melody and the chords first. So I wrote myself a little lead sheet, just the melody line and chord symbols. Tune with a very relaxed feeling melody and some really rich chords. And then I kind of almost reverse engineered it. I thought, how could I take this tune and make it fit into the perpetual motion style? How could I add a perpetual motion element to it? And the answer was this inner line, and I really stole this from Brad Meldau and the example that I gave you. The inner line is filling in all the blank spaces between the 2 parts. But it is kind of important which hand plays the parts, because what I'm often doing is I'm articulating the notes in the right hand intentionally different than the left hand to provide little counter melodies and a little bit of rhythm. I'm just going to demonstrate a little bit, and then I'll play the full thing for you. Counter melody, a counterbalance to the melody and the bass. So, I'm trying to add texture, not just this kind of murmuring of the perpetual motion, but these little interesting rhythms. Now, you guys might have noticed that this is in a really strange time signature. You see that the time signature there is 1816. So that's 3 groups of 6 16th notes. And this is not a meter that I would usually play in at all, but the perpetual motion texture kind of makes it possible. Because, if you look at that very first melody note, it comes in on the second 16th note, right? A place in the beat that I usually would not have any idea how to find. But since I'm filling in every beat, it makes it really pretty easy to find these syncopated rhythms. Good, I called this Van Gogh's Dream because it kind of has a swirling quality, and I imagine it as like, the scene that's painted in my head is like a rainy day in Amsterdam, kind of with pebble, gravelly streets, and just really moody. So let me play for you Van Gogh's Dream. Actually, before I do, let me show you the improvisation here. So it's very hard to improvise keeping an inner line between the 2 hands, right? You have to be very strict. So what I do instead is I'm going to put the accompaniment, the perpetual motion element, all into the left hand. So my left hand would play, which leaves my right hand free to improvise. So I'm kind of shifting the bottom 2 parts into the left hand. And what you might hear if you listen closely is that there's a lot of fun rhythmic things to do here, right? 18 is such a big number, I can divide it so many different ways. So for instance, instead of playing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I can play 1, 2, 3. complicated. I could play 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, what's really fun, sorry, I could go on all day about this, is I could go over the bar line and I could continue with groups of 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So there's all these really fun ways to create and mix up the rhythms in that left hand, which are going to make the right hand feel more different. All right, so let me play for you Van Gogh Street. You can see this is dedicated to my grandma. gonna show you briefly a couple more. So this is called homesick, and this is very unusual for what we generally think of as perpetual motion. Usually, perpetual motion is about being rhythmic. But you can see that the tempo marking here is 52 beats per minute, which is very slow, and the tempo text is pensive. And this was actually kind of the result of a compositional problem that I gave myself, which is oftentimes the way that I like to compose. I'll give myself some kind of a problem, challenge, or riddle, and then I'll see if I can figure out a way to make it not only achieve that goal, but sound pleasing. And the riddle here was actually to do with the counterpoint. So if you can see, this piece is written in 4 voices: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. And it's paired together in an unusual way. The soprano and the bass are always playing together. And the tenor and the alto are always playing together, the ones with their stems going towards the center. But they each have a different rule that they're following. The 2 outer voices, the soprano and the bass, are always moving in contrary motion. So when one's going up, the other's going down. Whereas the 2 middle voices are moving in parallel or similar motion, moving in the same direction. And the way that I'm thinking about this in this title, Homesick, is that I feel, at least personally, and maybe some of you can relate, that I have these 2 different impulses that are always kind of conflicting. One is to kind of follow the path that my parents and my grandparents followed, and to stay close to home, to stay near family, to do the things that are expected of me. And the other is to be adventurous, right? The other is to go against the grain, to go in contrary motion to what's expected, and to travel, to explore, to try something really brand new. And so that's how I'm thinking about these 2 different pairs of voices in this piece. So this one's a little different. Now you might say, well, what makes this perpetual motion? If you look, I've fitted the 2 pairs of voices together so that every single 8th note, there is a different note being played. So even when one pair of voices is resting, something else is happening. So they are fitting together kind of like the gears of a clock. So I'm probably not going to give quite a full performance, but I want to play a little bit for you of Homesick. And I recommend, by the way, try to pick out each of the 4 different voices. That's what I'm doing as I play, as I'm trying to listen and make sure I'm hearing and bringing out the bass, the tenor, the alto, and the soprano. That's how you're going to enjoy this piece the most. Now, one of the smart things I did when I was writing these etudes is I took a lesson from somebody who I know knows this perpetual motion style very well. I don't know if this name will mean anything to you, but I should give him credit. His name is Vardan Avsevian. And one of the insights that he shared with me that really influenced the way I wrote a lot of these pieces is that it's really interesting when you start crossing the hands or having the hands kind of bleed over one another. Because it's one thing to have, if you think about that first etude, you can clearly hear when it's the right or when it's the left hand. In fact, that's part of what makes it interesting, is you can hear bump, 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 bump. But it's also kind of interesting to blend the two hands and make it less obvious which hand is playing what. So if you look at this etude called Piccadilly Circus, you'll see that the top note of the left hand is the same as the top note of the right hand with the middle staffs, if that makes any sense. So basically, the entire time, my two thumbs are intertwined. My right hand thumb is always below my left hand thumb. And this creates kind of, to me, this effect where it's blended. It doesn't feel like it's one hand or the other. It feels like this single entity, which is really interesting. And this piece is kind of in a Brazilian, like a samba type of style. The bass line kind of reflects this typical Brazilian bass line. There's a lot of syncopation, and I think of this middle part as being like a shaker. So let me play this for you. It's called Piccadilly Circus. And I want you to listen for these inner lines. If you look at measure 3, you'll see that there's this really kind of complicated inner line. If you look at the tenutos, from that lower left hand F to the G on the end of 3, and then it actually connects to the right hand. And that's the most interesting and difficult part of playing this piece. So I'll play you, I'm not going to do the improvisation, but I'll just play you the written out portion of Piccadilly Circus. What's fun about this perpetual motion style, and it's really interesting, I guess I can't say how it sounds to you. To me, it sounds and feels very complicated and difficult. But if you play each hand individually, it's actually really simple music, right? If I play just the right hand, it's... not hard, it's not Rachmaninoff, right? And the left hand's basically the same. So one of the things that continues to fascinate me about this perpetual motion style is how you can make something more than the sum of its parts by having it fit together in a particular way. I have one more piece I want to show you, then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this project influenced my life, and then I want to have time for questions. So please be thinking of good questions. Your professors have guaranteed me that this is a class that will ask intelligent questions. If you came to the recital on Monday night, you heard Dr. A and myself play Temple Bells. And this is another piece that utilizes the hand crossing kind of principles. And so this has what we call an ostinato. An ostinato means a kind of endlessly repeating musical phrase. And the ostinato has two parts. One is this very typical bell phrase. That's kind of like... And then the left hand is crossing over and under that right hand and filling in the empty spaces to make it perpetual motion, right? You can see that every eighth note here is filled up. So... and I tried to make those nice, perfect, open intervals. I mean, perfect in terms of the interval quality, not that they're perfect in terms of my composition. I think they're pretty good. So that it had that feeling of ringing like a bell. So it's kind of these two intertwined bells. So I love these puzzles of piano playing. So the fun part is, how do you add to that? The left hand's already doing something, the right hand's already doing something, you're done. So what I ended up doing is putting melodies in the pinkies of the two hands. And the pinkies are always playing together. And the goal of having those two pinkies and they're spaced 2 octaves apart is that these also have this ringing quality. They have this quality like a bell. So there's kind of these 3 elements here, which are all in some way, I think, bell-like. So let me play you a little bit of temple bells so you can get a sense of these 3 parts together. It goes on from there, but that's kind of the general idea. Thank you. You pianists, this might remind you of Debussy. I feel like that's what I hear most often about this piece, that some of Debussy's kind of Asian-inspired pieces, like pagodes, seem kind of similar to this. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about how this affected my career. So I've had the real privilege since I was 23 or 24 to write instructional books for the Hal Leonard Corporation, as Dr. Ng said. The Hal Leonard Corporation, if you've never heard of them, you've all probably have some piece of music by them. They are the biggest music publisher in the US. I think the statistic is that they publish 17 new books every day, which is kind of nuts, right? And so I got to write instructional books for them. I got to write some repertoire books for them. And like I said, I have zero complaints. It has been and continues to be a great privilege. But I do want to just have a little bit of a business-minded thing for you. So in your mind, guess if I did an arrangement of Baby Shark, which I did, my proudest career moment, what percentage of those sales do you think would go to me as the person who actually wrote down the notes? Go ahead, just form a guess in your mind. We'll see who's closest. You'll get a prize. You got a T-shirt. Melody's got lots of T-shirts. So the correct answer is 2.5%. So you got to sell a lot of Baby Shark to make any kind of decent money off of that. And as an artist, what you might also think about with publishing too is that imagine how many beginning pianists there are in the world, quite a lot. And then imagine how many are still studying after a year, getting towards an intermediate level, slightly less, right? And then how many are still studying after 3 or 4 years, really, mastering an intermediate level, less. And then how many are still studying in college or, really achieving an artist level? Very few. So publishing companies always want the lowest possible level, which makes sense. They're businesses. They want to advertise to the most people. So I took this idea for the Perpetual Motion Etudes to my editor, and she said, thanks, but no thanks, right? There's not going to be a lot of people who are going to be interested in this kind of music. It's no Baby Shark. And there's not a lot of people who can play it. So she said, you should look into self-publishing. And so that's what I did with this book. And I contacted friends who I knew had self-published. I did a lot of research. I hired an engraver, which is the person who makes the music look professional quality. I hired a designer who makes the cover, who makes things look nice on the page. I hired an editor to work with to have a second pair of eyes looking at everything. And I figured out basically how to self-publish. So like I mentioned, this I think was published in March 2020, and I actually had a big tour booked and was going to try to promote this with the idea that this would become part of the piano repertoire, right? And this is very hard to achieve. For those of you who play piano, you know that the piano repertoire is pretty well set. We got a lot of great music. Chopin, Rachmaninoff, Debussy, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, all wrote so many great works for piano. But I thought, hey, we always need new contemporary pieces, and this idea of combining improvisation with written out music is kind of an unusual. But of course, March 2020, we all know what happened. All my tour got canceled. I stayed at home, and I got inspired to take on a project that had been also percolating in my mind for a long time, and that was to write an instructional book on playing solo jazz piano. There's a lot of jazz instructional books out there, but I have never really seen a good one on how to be a solo jazz pianist, which I kind of consider my specialty. So I got writing really fast, and in August 2020, I published this book called Playing Solo Jazz Piano. And people were much more interested than I thought. There were like, my hypothesis that people would be interested because there wasn't anything else like this out there, turned out to be actually more correct than I thought. And you could see my great sales of the Perpetual Motion etude book were far eclipsed by this book, Playing Solo Jazz Piano. And it was on Amazon, and every day it would get 4 or 5 or 6 sales. And by the way, Amazon prints things on demand, so when you get a sale from Amazon, you just have money in your pocket. Like, it's great. They ship out the book, they deal with it, and I see something arriving in my bank account. And that was so successful that I then thought, hey, I'm getting good at this self-publishing thing. I've got a good team. I'm starting to get an audience. I also started a YouTube channel at that time and was starting to get more and more subscribers and interest. So I thought, hey, I've got an audience, I've got a good theme, and I had this other idea for a book that had been percolating for a while, which was something that really held a jazz pianist's hand who was maybe coming from a classical background and wanted to learn jazz piano, and gave them very step-by-step lessons, assignments, listening guides, suggestions. And so I wrote this book, called it Jazz Piano Fundamentals, and it crushed the other 2 books. And it's usually in the top 10, actually, still on Amazon in the jazz category, which is pretty cool. And of course, as a greedy person, I'm only partially joking, but as a person who can read the tea leaves of, hey, this is successful, I said, well, that's book 1, let's write a book 2. And people actually started asking me via my YouTube channel, via email, when's book 2 coming out? I can't wait for book 2. And I also needed a textbook, because I teach 2 semesters of jazz piano, and I was using this first level as my textbook for the first semester. So I wrote Jazz Piano Fundamentals book 2, and look, it crushed the other one, right? And then at the very end, you can see I just put out a second edition of the Playing Solo Jazz Piano book. And so maybe it's a little bit crass to talk about money, but we're all musicians here, right? And you guys need to know things going into your career. So when I publish an arrangement of Baby Shark, I make 2.5% of the profits. Off of my self-published books, which cost more than my arrangement of Baby Shark, I get 60% of the profits when I sell through Amazon. And when I sell through my site, especially if it's a PDF, I get 100% of the profits, which is pretty cool. So again, I apologize if you find this crass, but this December I had my best month ever as a publisher. Of course, December is a great month to sell things, we all know. But I made $13,000 in 1 month through my self-publishing company, which is more than I make in my full-time job as a college professor. So the lesson here is not that I'm great. And it's not that you should start your own publishing company, although I welcome you to. But the lesson here is actually, if I had not put out these Perpetual Motion etudes, which was this kind of quixotic project that nobody was going to play these pieces, but if I hadn't gone for it and decided, hey, I want to learn this skill, I want to write these pieces, and I want to share them. I want to make sure that I have a professional level product to share with people. That I never would have been launched on this path through self-publishing. I never would have learned how to do it. I never would have figured it out. And so I guess the moral that I want you to take away is to create things. Even if you're not sure where they're going to lead, even if you're not sure that they're going to be profitable, even if you don't have a master plan, the act of creating things will lead somewhere in your career. If for no other reason than you'll get the reputation as a doer who makes things. And I know at this campus, everybody here is ambitious and on a great path, and you're already king of the crop. So you're probably like, yeah, I know, I get it. But that's my message to you. Take that project that you've been wanting to do, finish it, get it into a presentable form, and don't be too concerned with where it's going to lead, because the act of doing will teach you a lot. So that's my talk, and I'm happy. I think I got a little bit more than 5 minutes to take some questions. Yes.
So, especially in your first piece, I know you said you have like influences from your teachers and like Mr. Nadal and everything. But I was wondering if you've had like experience from like 20th century composers. I've heard like elements of like Hemistera, like that chordal elements and stuff like that. Maybe a little bit of getting to.
Yeah, so if you couldn't hear the question up there, the question was whether there were also elements of kind of 20th century composers. And the answer is a little bit. You know, jazz and 20th century music tend to merge a lot. And so you brought up Hemistera and Ligeti, and I have played some Ligeti. The Devil's Staircase, you know, is a great example of perpetual motion, actually. A really, really cool and difficult piece. But more of my inspiration tends to come from the jazz side. But it's interesting, like I said, these things mix. So for example, Brad Meldau is very obsessed with Johannes Brahms. So his music is filtered through Brahms. And you mentioned chordal harmony, and that comes to me more through McCoy Tyner than through Hemistera or any 20th century composers. But of course, they're all influencing one another. So there's not necessarily separation. So I do know some of that music. I'm not sure that I would say that I'm highly influenced by it. One composer who influences me a lot harmonically is Messiaen. I really like the harmonies of Messiaen. So yeah, great question. Thank you. Did you have a question?
I was going to ask, when you're writing, how do you go about writing a more interesting piece than, I guess, what you would just hear in your head and compiling on top of that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the question is, when you're composing, how do you maybe take it from just being a melody and some chords to the next step? Is that a fair summary of the question? So for me, a lot of it has to do with how I present it on the piano. And so by like familiarizing myself with the piano literature and tradition, you kind of realize what the possibilities are. So I might think, instead of thinking just melody and chords, I might think of it, okay, let's put it into 4 parts. And then that kind of gets me on a whole different track to thinking, oh, the alto part kind of has this interesting melody here, let's embellish that. Or I might think, contrapuntally, because I've played Bach and played chorales and things like that. And so like that piece Homesick, is generated more by 4 different melodies kind of interacting than just one melody and chords. So one of the games that I like to play as a composer is I'll open up a book of classical music like to a random page, and I'll kind of look at the different ways that things are presented on the piano, not necessarily the harmonies and the melodies, but how is Beethoven, making the 2 hands interact there? And I'll take those elements as the inspiration to then dress up my melodies and my chords. Does that kind of make sense? And if you're not a pianist, you can do that with whatever the instrumentation is. You could find a string quartet and imitate that kind of texture. You could find an orchestral piece and do that. So that's kind of how I think about it. Yes?
Looking back right now where you are, what do you think was most valuable in your undergraduate years, and what do you wish to have taken advantage more in your undergrad?
What a great question. What a teacherly question. So for me, in my undergraduate, I started as just a jazz performance major, and I remember at like the very first party of the year, I met somebody who said they were a music theory major, and I like laughed at them. I was like, that's the lamest thing ever. Fast forward to my junior year, I added a music theory major because I just was fascinated by this thought of getting under the hood of the music and figuring out why does it sound the way that it sounds. And that led me to some people who thought a little bit differently, to people who were a little bit more analytic than my jazz studies professors. And that really opened up my mind to become a musician who, isn't just following exactly in the jazz tradition, which I love, but is incorporating kind of all of these other elements. So when I was a senior, I got to take a course in improvising in the style of Debussy preludes, which is like the coolest course I've ever taken still to this day. So for me, finding those things slightly outside of the major that I kind of thought that I would be taking and the path that I thought was the straightest and narrowest path was really valuable. There was a second part to that question.
What do you wish to have more in those undergrad years?
Yeah. Well, I turned out perfect, so I wouldn't change a thing. I had no idea about anything relating to business when I graduated college, and it's part of the reason I went for a master's in English and comparative literature, because I didn't even have the first thought of what I would do to make money when I left school. And there's a certain beauty to that. You know, I went to a great conservatory, and the whole idea is just to focus and learn how to play your instrument incredibly well. But I don't know, you know, when I'm advising students, I want them to have some kind of an idea of what they might do to make money when they leave school, just to have more options open. So that's probably what I would change. Is I would do a little bit more thinking and maybe a little bit more studying about how musicians actually make a living. Do we have time for one more? Yeah.
So if you're sitting on in the piano and playing a piece, the Rachmaninoff piano concerto, how are you able to like interpret all the crescendos and diminuendos and all the phrases in that piece, or in any piece?
Well, I've certainly never tackled that piece. It's not in my plans. You know, to me, and I'm not like a classical musician, but to me, the markings are things that I want to perceive in terms of the sound. You know, I don't need to have a photographic memory of the page, but I need to figure out what the energy of each phrase is. And I need to figure out what's kind of leading to a more energetic place where we want to gain momentum, where we want to stop momentum. So personally, I think more in those terms and less, okay, there's a crescendo starting on beat 3 of measure 34. But trying to figure out why and what the effect is. And when I have that information at hand, I feel like those things kind of occur naturally because I know where I might be aiming for or where I might be dissolving away from or which voice I want to bring out. So to me, it's crucial to gain a real understanding of why those things are happening in the music. My understanding may or may not match Rachmaninoff's understanding, but it helps me really retain and authentically express a piece instead of just simply playing it because it's there. So that's, I guess, my best answer to that question. All right, I think we're out of time. Can I take one more? Okay, let's quickly.
Okay, in the Van Gogh piece,
Yeah.
you wrote in 1816.
Yeah.
Okay? And you did that because of how often you're playing with the rhythms and whatnot. Let's
Right.
say like the first one, you privileged 4/4. You could have wrote that in 1616. So at what point, I guess for you, do you choose to privilege, say, the smallest denominator versus maybe having something that is a little bit more, say, common, or even although you could have wrote in 9/8, for example, right? Or you could have done that one in 1816, right? So at what point do you kind of privilege one meter over another?
Yeah, that's a good question. So to me, the 4/4 still has a dance to it where I could still tap my foot and kind of feel the sway of everything in 4. And of course, 4/4 is our most common meter. So for me, it just kind of made sense. If I tried to count 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 2, 3 with the 1816 piece, to me that is like it doesn't flow at all in that way. So I considered 9/8 just because it's a more normal meter. But for me, if I were to like try to count that out and feel the sway of it, it just doesn't have that kind of a dance. So I think intelligent people can kind of disagree about how to write some of these meters. But to me, in the context of my music, it kind of comes down to that dance element. So I don't know if that's a conclusive answer, but that's the best I've got.
That's great. I completely agree. You could have done it either way.
Yeah.
What you were thinking about.
Yeah.
That's great.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. Really appreciate your time.
I just want to say thank you and appreciative, especially for the theme. I think that most importantly is we were in backstage. The gist of the gold part is actually when we were talking is we will say you'll hear your teachers and musicians say, "Oh, we're so lucky." We definitely are because without that 50%, you can't achieve anything. However, that's only 50%. You emphasize so much by doing what you love, but you got to be really, really hardworking at it. And then opportunities come and then you scrap it. And this is how actually we met. We did not know each other. Yamaha put us together to have lunch, like a year before the pandemic.
Yeah.
But he is so prepared, and I'm also so prepared to run a festival. But I want to really, really appreciate that, because I think on Tuesday we talk about profitability, you know. I think it's a short sight if you think music doesn't make money, because like I said, all the research has indicated, even all the way to kindergarten, is like, whoa, music really makes you smart. And all the Nobel winners have the hobby in arts and music. And so it's the matter of if you follow through, right? Instead of doing half, like you follow through with your passion, and then you're like, okay, what can I actually get more out of it and to really, really make it bigger? And then the money follows. So I really appreciate that. I think it's really, really meaningful, because I think in this town particularly, right, you all are here, some of you even dropped from engineering or business to really go against the wave. But as you see firsthand, like, if you start using your brain, you're all very brainy. You're the highest ACT in the state. If you use your brain and intelligence and combine and follow the passion, then you will get all the best-selling Amazon sellers right here. So I want to say thank you so much. We're really grateful.
I sure do.
Yes.
May I make some announcements?
Yes.
First of all, Jeremy, thank you so much for reminding us that music is so incredibly multi-dimensional. It goes so far beyond performance, but thank you for all the wonderful energy you brought to our campus.
Thank you so much.
Students, let's see, I had 3 things. One is make sure you sign in. There are only 2 students signed in right now, so at the top of the stairs. The second is there's going to be a wonderful graduate trombone recital tonight. Stephen 6 at 7:30. I sat in on his pre-recital jury. It was fantastic. So keep in mind the recital credit that you need to get, but more importantly, really the critical part of supporting your peers. And the third, just small ditty I'll mention is that thinking about WLRH, our public radio station on campus, the NPR station, a friend of this department, Dory Nutch, who was actually on a panel with Jeremy earlier this week. She and I have been friends forever. She played horn in Huntsville Symphony for, I don't know, 30 plus years. She's taught for our department. She is doing a new radio show called Dory's Listening Party, and she has been bugging me for months to be her first inaugural guest. So my students can't do it because we've got class, but at 11:05 today on WLRH, she's premiering that radio show. She tasked me with sharing what my very favorite pieces of music were, and you might be surprised that I'm not such a classical music nerd. So I'll leave you with that. Any other announcements? Okay, y'all. Hope you have a great day.